The police. In some communities, it means safety and service. In others,
it wasn't safe for the citizens, it wasn't safe for law enforcement.
It creates feelings of fear and distrust. It's a position of power facing pressure to change. This week, we're in Eugene, Oregon. We'll show you how they respond to certain 911 calls differently here. This week, we look at a variety of views on the future of policing in America.
We let them know that they're steering the ship and that we're simply there to support them.
This is The Race. Welcome to The Race. I'm Chris Stewart. When you call 911, in many cases, a police officer is sent to help. Here in Eugene, Oregon, they believe that isn't always the right person to respond. So they send someone else.
There is a person outside who they seemed out of sorts, just kind of wandering around.
Countless times every day across the country.
There's a guy right behind my back fence in the alley near the dumpster moaning.
Calls for help.
Kind of having some sort of mental crisis.
That can be hard to answer.
Wound care equipment, saline, gauze, Band-Aids, naloxone for overdoses.
In Eugene, sometimes that answer is people like Dan Feltz.
Sometimes what we need in our most desperate hour is just somebody to talk to.
In this city and neighboring Springfield, Oregon, when a non-emergency, non-criminal call comes in,
thought it'd be worth like a swing by so that someone more qualified could check on them.
Sure.
Dispatchers can send a trained mental health professional like Feltz instead of a police officer.
Make sure that people have access to resources other than law enforcement when they're having mental health crises.
He's a member of CAHOOTS. It stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets.
We don't show up with weaponry. We don't show up with handcuffs.
The belief is unarmed CAHOOTS teams of crisis workers and medics can better respond to people struggling with issues like mental health or emotional crisis.
When a police officer goes and they look like me, gun, badge, it's a little bit demonstrative, and sometimes it has a tendency to escalate the situation.
Chris Skinner is Eugene's police chief.
When somebody like CAHOOTS goes, where it's people that are just kind of dressed the same, they kind of look the same, they have a softer approach, it has a tendency to de-escalate those things.
There are lots of these call types that are nonviolent in nature. They're simply somebody crying out for help.
Ben Brubaker is a director at Whitebird Clinic. The nonprofit has run CAHOOTS since the late 80s. Now communities are calling them for guidance. Denver started a similar pilot program last month.
We need to change the way that our public safety systems work and see, how does public safety look through a different lens?
A viewpoint of listening.
Eugene Police and Fire.
I was wondering if you could connect me to CAHOOTS.
Listening to voices they believe across the country aren't heard enough.
We are there to show up, bear witness, see you as you are, as a human being, and offer whatever kind of support we can without judgment.
While some departments change their approach, certain groups are crafting plans for a policeless society. Alexa Liaco spoke to one about its vision for the future.
We didn't think this moment would be here this soon.
A moment of anguish, anger, and opportunity.
Aiming to change the narrative around policing from one that's more reform-minded to one that's abolition-minded.
Peter Van Kennett has spent the last several years working on a 150-year performance review of the Minneapolis Police Department with nonprofit MPD 150.
There's never been a point in the police department where there hasn't been a large amounts of race and class-based violence.
Their findings document the department's influence on the community and its lack of oversight. Since 1963, 5 separate committees were formed to monitor ethics within the department, only to be dissolved.
These committees are designed in such a way that they don't actually have real power, real teeth. They can only make recommendations.
Seeing the past and living through today's unrest, MPD 150 began planning for a police-free future.
Not that everybody here is in favor of it, but now everybody here has to talk about it.
That conversation launched into the mainstream by the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers. And as the Minneapolis Police Department 3rd Precinct was set on fire by community members calling for change, the Minneapolis City Council listened, pledging to dismantle the department. But can we really live in a world without officers on the streets? MPD 150 says there are ways of making that happen.
It's about looking at underlying causes, putting money into employment, putting money into drug treatment, putting all these things are core principles of abolition.
It also means diverting 911 calls to the right responder.
We're not trying to make it so that there's nobody to call. We're trying to figure out who you can actually call.
But the Minneapolis police chief says he's not leaving without a fight for reform first, even with the issues the department has faced.
I did not abandon this department then, and I will not abandon this department now.
A police-free city may take years, but Van Kennett believes it will come.
I hope that we're able to look back at these few years as a revolution in history. This really could be the place where that happens.
For The Race, I'm Alexa Liacco.
There is a renewed push to reform qualified immunity. That's what protects police officers and some others from civil lawsuits. We're taking a look at where it came from and what the future may hold.
Let's say you're walking down the street and someone clearly violates your rights. The rule of law says they should be held accountable, and you'd expect that they would. But can the same be said about police officers who violate a person's rights? There's a legal doctrine called qualified immunity that protects public employees, like police officers, from being held personally liable for knowingly violating someone else's rights, as long as the officer didn't break any clearly established laws in the process. We'll get back to what that means later. Critics argue qualified immunity tilts the scales of justice and makes it hard to hold officers accountable for crimes they admit to committing. The legal path that led to qualified immunity started with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1871. Congress said every American has the right to sue any public employee who violate their rights. Then, in the late 60s, a Supreme Court ruling that would start morphing the concept into what we know today. 1967, a court ruling granted some exceptions to police officers who felt they acted in good faith and believed they acted within the law. 15 years later, in 1982, a new ruling put the burden on the citizen to prove the officer's actions broke a clearly established right. That means unless the citizen presents a legal case where an official was found guilty of the same particular conduct under the same specific context, the officer is protected from liability. The Supreme Court has granted one exception for a particularly cruel case in 2002. In June 2020, the court declined to take up a petition asking it to re-examine qualified immunity.
The race continues next.